Welcome to Professor Jeffrey Sachs's commentary. The script portrays Netanyahu's image of strength as unraveling under the weight of Gaza's humanitarian crisis, domestic turmoil, and growing global isolation, arguing that only diplomacy and legitimacy, not endless war, can restore stability. Benjamin Netanyahu has long cultivated the image of Israel's strongman. For decades, he has presented himself as the indispensable leader, the architect of security, the guardian against threats, and the strategist who ensures Israel's survival in a hostile region. This narrative has been central not only to his political longevity, but also to his claim of indispensability at home and abroad. Yet the image of strength increasingly masks a fragile reality. Netanyahu's rise to prominence was built on his ability to project certainty. Whether addressing the United Nations with a dramatic warning about Iran's nuclear program or rallying domestic supporters with promises of security, his brand has always been one of confidence. He has consistently portrayed himself as the one leader capable of steering Israel through existential dangers. This cultivated persona has served him well politically. For many Israelis, Netanyahu's defiance in the face of criticism abroad and his mastery of rhetoric at home symbolize stability and resilience. For American leaders, his assertiveness reinforced the view that Israel was a reliable ally, firmly guided by an experienced hand. But today, cracks in this image are impossible to ignore. The war in Gaza, launched under his direction, has produced immense suffering without delivering decisive results. International condemnation has grown sharper, and accusations of war crimes hang over his government. What was once presented as a demonstration of strength now appears increasingly as an exercise in denial and overreach. At home, Netanyahu faces widespread protests, anger over the October 7th security failures, and ongoing corruption trials that threaten his legitimacy. His coalition, built on fragile alliances with far-right parties, is united less by vision than by necessity. The longer the war drags on, the more his leadership appears to be driven by survival politics rather than strategic direction. The isolation Netanyahu now faces on the world stage is striking. At the United Nations, his speeches are met with walkouts or empty seats rather than applause. Across Europe and the global South, his government is viewed less as a defender of security and more as an aggressor unwilling to pursue peace. Even in Washington, where support for Israel has long been bipartisan, dissent is growing not only among younger voters, but within Congress itself. This erosion of legitimacy underscores the deeper reality. Netanyahu's image of strength is increasingly disconnected from Israel's diplomatic and political position. What once seemed unshakable now looks precarious. Netanyahu's stumble is not sudden but cumulative. It reflects years of relying on war and defiance as substitutes for diplomacy and compromise. The cultivated image of the strong leader remains on display, but the reality beneath it is one of weakness, isolation, and fragility. In the next section, we will examine the central theater of this unraveling Gaza. It is there, amid destruction and humanitarian catastrophe, that the gap between Netanyahu's rhetoric and the truth of his policies becomes most stark. For Netanyahu, Gaza has always been more than a battleground. It has been the stage on which he asserts his strength, the arena in which he promises to deliver security to Israelis while weakening Palestinian aspirations for sovereignty. Yet Gaza also reveals the limits of this doctrine. The devastation inflicted there may demonstrate overwhelming force, but it has not delivered victory. Instead, it has exposed Netanyahu's inability to resolve conflict, deepened Israel's isolation, and generated a humanitarian catastrophe that has shocked the conscience of much of the world. The official aim of Israel's military campaign in Gaza has been clear: the elimination of Hamas. Netanyahu has framed this as a fight against terrorism, a war necessary to ensure Israel's security. But months of bombardment, thousands of civilian deaths, and the destruction of Gaza's infrastructure have not achieved that objective. Hamas remains resilient, its political influence arguably strengthened among Palestinians who see no viable alternative to resistance. The truth is that military power, no matter how overwhelming, cannot resolve what is ultimately a political conflict. Efforts to eradicate Hamas without addressing Palestinian rights are doomed to repeat the same cycle: violence, temporary calm, and renewed violence. The human cost in Gaza is staggering. Entire neighborhoods lie in ruins. Hospitals operate without electricity. Children suffer from malnutrition and trauma. International agencies warn of famine and epidemic disease. For the people of Gaza, daily life has become a struggle for survival. Yet Netanyahu continues to frame the campaign as a defensive necessity, dismissing global outrage as hypocrisy. The denial of the humanitarian crisis or its reduction to collateral damage not only dehumanizes Palestinians, but also corrodes Israel's moral standing. Even long-standing allies struggle to reconcile their values with the images of devastation. Around the world, condemnation of Israel's actions in Gaza has grown. The United Nations has debated resolutions accusing Israel of possible war crimes and even genocide. Protests have filled streets from London to New York to Jakarta, uniting diverse voices in opposition to the destruction. The global South, already skeptical of Western double standards, sees Gaza as evidence that the rhetoric of human rights applies selectively. For Netanyahu, this represents a profound loss. Israel, once able to count on near-automatic support in many international forums, now faces isolation. Walkouts at the UN during his speeches symbolize not just anger, but also the erosion of his legitimacy. The paradox of Gaza is that Israel's overwhelming military superiority does not translate into security. Bombing campaigns may destroy buildings, but they cannot erase grievances or aspirations. The blockade may limit movement, but it cannot extinguish the desire for dignity. By focusing on force rather than diplomacy, Netanyahu mistakes control for victory. In truth, the Gaza campaign has made Israel less secure. It has hardened Palestinian resistance, fueled regional hostility, and increased Israel's diplomatic vulnerability. What is presented as strength is in fact fragility, the reliance on coercion where compromise is absent. Gaza lays bare the contradictions of Netanyahu's leadership. His strategy claims to deliver safety, but produces endless insecurity. It presents destruction as a solution, but leaves the root problem unresolved. It proclaims victory where none exists. In Gaza, Netanyahu's stumble is visible to the world. The devastation may silence buildings, but it amplifies the voices calling for accountability and peace. In the next section, we will turn to the broader implications: how the Gaza war and Netanyahu's denial of its human cost has led to the collapse of moral authority for Israel and its allies, exposing a deeper crisis of legitimacy in the global order. Nations, like leaders, derive their power not only from military or financial strength, but also from moral authority. For decades, Israel has sought to portray itself as both a democracy under siege and a society bound by Western values of law and rights. Netanyahu has relied heavily on this narrative, presenting Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East and framing its wars as defensive struggles against terrorism. Yet, Gaza has revealed the profound erosion of that moral claim. What once gave Israel a measure of global legitimacy is slipping away, leaving isolation in its place. The core of the moral collapse lies in Gaza's humanitarian disaster. Images of bombed out neighborhoods, grieving families, and starving children speak more clearly than any diplomatic statement. International organizations describe conditions in terms usually reserved for catastrophe zones, famine, epidemic, and mass displacement. When such suffering is met not with remorse but with defiance, the gap between rhetoric and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Netanyahu insists that Israel targets only militants and that civilian deaths are tragic accidents of war. But the scale of destruction suggests otherwise. To much of the world, these explanations ring hollow. The credibility of Israel's moral narrative has been undermined by the evidence on the ground. This collapse of moral authority is not limited to Israel. The United States, by providing weapons aid and diplomatic cover, is seen as complicit. Washington condemns Russia for violating Ukrainian sovereignty while enabling Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. It calls for accountability abroad while blocking resolutions at the United Nations. The result is a widening perception of double standards. For countries in the global south, Gaza confirms what they have long suspected, that the rules of the international order are applied selectively depending on the identity of the violator. This erodes not only Israel's credibility, but also America's, deepening the legitimacy crisis of the Western-led system. Even among Israel's traditional allies, dissent is growing. European governments are facing protests demanding accountability, and some are reevaluating their arms sales and political support. Within Jewish communities worldwide, divisions have deepened. Many who once supported Israel uncritically now question Netanyahu's choices, struggling to reconcile their values with the images from Gaza. Inside Israel itself, critics argue that endless war has corroded the very democratic principles Netanyahu claims to defend. The reliance on force over compromise, censorship over debate, and coalition politics over unity has left the society fractured. The erosion of moral authority matters because legitimacy is as crucial as military might. Nations can maintain control through coercion for a time, but without legitimacy, they face endless resistance and isolation. Netanyahu's policies may suppress Palestinian aspirations temporarily, but they cannot extinguish them. By dismissing diplomacy and denying rights, he ensures that Israel remains locked in perpetual conflict. History offers parallels. Apartheid South Africa possessed military strength, yet its legitimacy collapsed under the weight of global opposition to its injustice. Israel risks following a similar trajectory if it continues to rely on force without addressing the political root of the conflict. Netanyahu's stumble is not only about military stalemate or political weakness, it is about the loss of moral authority, the collapse of a narrative that once shielded Israel from broader condemnation. Today, that shield is gone, replaced by growing calls for accountability and justice. In the next section, we will look inward to Israel itself, where Netanyahu's authority faces deep challenges, mass protests, coalition fragility, and the looming shadow of corruption trials. The erosion of legitimacy abroad is mirrored by a crisis of leadership at home. Netanyahu's challenges are not confined to the international stage. Within Israel itself, his position is increasingly precarious. Once hailed by supporters as the steady hand guiding the nation through turbulent times, he now faces mounting criticism, widespread protests, and the constant reminder of his unresolved corruption trials. The image of the strongman, carefully cultivated for decades, is undercut by a political reality defined by fragility. The Hamas assault of October 7 was a turning point. For many Israelis, it shattered the assumption that Netanyahu's hardline policies guaranteed security. If the leader who claimed to be Israel's ultimate protector could not prevent such a devastating attack, then his credibility as the nation's guardian was deeply compromised. In the weeks that followed, protests erupted across Israel. Families of victims demanded accountability, reservists questioned the government's competence, and opposition parties called for inquiries. Netanyahu, rather than addressing these criticisms, directly deflected blame onto security officials and coalition partners, further undermining trust in his leadership. Netanyahu's political survival depends on a fragile coalition of far-right and ultra-religious parties. This alliance has enabled him to remain in office, but it has also deepened divisions within Israeli society. Policies once considered fringe, aggressive settlement expansion, judicial overhauls, hardline religious laws have become central to the government's agenda. This coalition is less about shared vision than about mutual necessity. Netanyahu needs their support to stay in power amid his legal troubles, while they need him to advance their ideological priorities. The result is a government that survives day to day but struggles to provide coherent direction. Looming over Netanyahu's premiership are his ongoing corruption cases. Charges of bribery, fraud, and breach of trust have not gone away, even as war and political turmoil dominate headlines. For many Israelis, these cases symbolize a leader more concerned with personal survival than national well-being. The perception that Netanyahu prioritizes his legal defense over governance erodes public trust. His maneuvers to weaken the judiciary are widely seen as attempts to protect himself from accountability, sparking some of the largest protests in Israel's history. The judiciary crisis has exposed fault lines that go beyond Netanyahu touching the very core of Israeli democracy. The combination of war, corruption, and political polarization has left Israeli society deeply strained. Protests fill city streets not only against Netanyahu personally, but against the direction of the state itself. Secular and religious communities clash over cultural issues. Settlers and peace advocates remain locked in bitter conflict. Young Israelis question the future of a society defined by perpetual war. Netanyahu has often thrived in division, presenting himself as the only leader capable of navigating a fractured society. But today the divisions are so deep that his claim to indispensability rings hollow. Far from uniting Israel, his leadership amplifies the fractures. Netanyahu's domestic fragility mirrors his international isolation. At home, he faces mistrust, protests, and legal peril. Abroad, he faces condemnation and a decline in legitimacy. His political survival depends not on strength, but on the constant balancing of fragile alliances and the deflection of blame. In the next section, we will shift focus to the United States. For decades, Netanyahu has relied on Washington's unconditional support to sustain his policies. But as U.S. politics and public opinion evolve, even that alliance shows signs of strain, raising the question of whether America will remain the unshakable pillar of Netanyahu's survival. For decades, Netanyahu's political strength has rested not only on his domestic base, but also on the steadfast backing of the United States. Washington has been Israel's indispensable ally, supplying weapons, diplomatic cover, and political legitimacy. Yet what once seemed like unshakable support now shows signs of strain. The U.S., while still providing extraordinary aid, is increasingly constrained by its own domestic politics, shifting public opinion, and waning credibility on the global stage. For Netanyahu, America remains a lifeline, but it is no longer the unqualified ally it once was. The United States provides Israel with more than $3.8 billion in annual military assistance, a package that forms the foundation of Israel's military capability. From precision bombs to advanced fighter jets, U.S. weapons are deeply embedded in Israel's campaigns, including the ongoing war in Gaza. Without this support, Israel's ability to sustain prolonged conflicts would be severely limited. This aid, however, is increasingly scrutinized. Images of destruction in Gaza fuel criticism within the U.S., especially among younger generations and progressive lawmakers. For many Americans, unconditional aid looks less like a strategic necessity and more like complicity in a humanitarian disaster. Just as important as weapons has been U.S. diplomacy. Washington has repeatedly used its veto at the United Nations Security Council to block resolutions critical of Israel. This shield has protected Israel from accountability, ensuring that investigations into human rights violations or calls for ceasefires are stalled. However, this practice also comes at a cost. Each veto isolates the U.S. alongside Israel against the overwhelming consensus of the international community. What once appeared to be global leadership now seems like obstruction. America's credibility as a defender of international law is eroded, tying its reputation ever more closely to Netanyahu's choices. Domestic U.S. politics are also shifting. While bipartisan support for Israel remains strong in Congress, cracks are beginning to appear. Progressive Democrats openly call for conditions on aid, citing human rights concerns. Among the American public, polls show growing skepticism, particularly among younger voters who view Palestinian rights as inseparable from broader struggles for justice. This shift creates new constraints. Presidents and members of Congress cannot ignore changing public opinion indefinitely. As America becomes more divided on Israel, Netanyahu can no longer rely on unconditional, uncritical support. Perhaps the most profound challenge for Netanyahu is that U.S. credibility itself is now closely tied to his policies. When Washington defends Israel's actions in Gaza, it exposes itself to charges of hypocrisy, condemning aggression elsewhere while excusing it in Palestine. For much of the world, America's role looks less like leadership and more like complicity. This dynamic weakens not only Netanyahu, but also the United States. Both find themselves isolated, their claims to uphold democracy and law contradicted by their actions. The alliance, once an asset for both, increasingly appears as a liability. Netanyahu has long relied on America as his ultimate guarantor, the ally that would shield him from international and domestic pressure alike. But the U.S. is no longer the unqualified ally it once was. Growing political dissent, public skepticism, and global backlash have turned support into a double-edged sword. For Netanyahu, the very alliance that sustains him now exposes his vulnerabilities. In the next section, we will widen the lens to the regional stage. Netanyahu's policies, sustained by U.S. backing, have not contained conflict but spread it, fueling instability across Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran, and deepening the crisis of security for Israel and the wider Middle East. Conflicts rarely remain contained. Netanyahu's policies, focused narrowly on immediate threats, have triggered ripple effects across the Middle East. Gaza is not an isolated battlefield. It is a flashpoint that reverberates through Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, and Iran. Far from enhancing Israel's security, this widening arc of confrontation leaves the region more unstable and Israel more vulnerable. The regional consequences reveal the unsustainability of Netanyahu's doctrine of endless conflict. In Lebanon, Hezbollah positions itself as the defender of Palestinian resistance. Cross-border skirmishes have intensified, raising the specter of a broader war. Israel's strikes on Lebanese territory justified as deterrence, risk provoking escalation that could engulf both nations. Hezbollah's arsenal, far more formidable than Hamas's, represents a constant reminder that Gaza is only one front in a multi-front conflict. For Netanyahu, each strike meant to project strength instead highlights fragility. Israel cannot decisively defeat Hezbollah without risking a catastrophic regional war. Syria, already devastated by more than a decade of civil war, has become another arena for confrontation. Israeli airstrikes target Iranian forces and supply routes, aiming to curtail Tehran's influence. Yet these strikes entangle Israel deeper in a conflict with no resolution, reinforcing the perception that it seeks dominance rather than peace. The Syrian theater illustrates a larger pattern. By projecting force across borders, Israel fuels resentment and further embeds itself in regional rivalries. Even distant Yemen feels the ripple effect. The Houthis, aligned with Iran, have declared solidarity with Palestinians, launching drones and missiles in symbolic defiance of Israel and its allies. While militarily limited, these actions carry symbolic weight. They demonstrate that Gaza's suffering resonates far beyond its borders, linking disparate groups in a shared narrative of resistance. Netanyahu may dismiss such gestures as marginal, but they show how his policies galvanize rather than deter opposition. At the heart of the regional ripple effect is Iran. For decades, Netanyahu has cast Tehran as Israel's existential enemy. His opposition to the Iran nuclear deal, JCPOA, and his calls for international pressure reflect a strategy of confrontation over engagement. Yet, this strategy has backfired. Sanctions and sabotage have not ended Iran's nuclear ambitions or regional influence. Instead, Iran has expanded its partnerships, deepened ties with Russia and China, and strengthened its regional allies by framing Iran solely as a threat to be neutralized. Netanyahu ensures perpetual tension without resolution. Perhaps the most profound ripple effect is political. Arab states that once cautiously engaged with Israel through the Abraham Accords now face intense domestic pressure to distance themselves. Public opinion in the Arab world overwhelmingly condemns Israeli actions in Gaza. Leaders cannot ignore these sentiments indefinitely without risking instability at home. This dynamic undermines Netanyahu's claim that Israel can normalize relations while sidelining Palestine. The Gaza war has made clear that the Palestinian question remains central to regional politics. Without addressing it, normalization will remain fragile and incomplete. The regional ripple effect demonstrates the hollowness of Netanyahu's doctrine. Far from securing Israel, it spreads conflict across multiple fronts, empowers adversaries, and alienates potential partners. By ignoring diplomacy and relying on force, Netanyahu has not contained instability, he has amplified it. In the final section, we will step back to consider the larger picture. Netanyahu's stumble is not only about one leader or one war. It reflects the unsustainability of a strategy rooted in denial and force. The choice ahead is stark: continue down the path of endless conflict or embrace diplomacy and legitimacy as the true foundations of peace. The story of Netanyahu's stumble is not simply the story of one leader under pressure. It is the story of a strategy that has come to an end. For years, Netanyahu built his authority on an image of strength, unyielding toward adversaries, dismissive of criticism, and confident in America's backing. Yet, the crises of Gaza, global condemnation, domestic fragility, and regional instability expose the weakness behind the facade. The question now is not whether Netanyahu has stumbled, but whether Israel itself can change course before the costs become irreversible. Netanyahu's approach rests on the assumption that endless war can serve as a substitute for diplomacy. By keeping conflicts unresolved, by framing adversaries as implacable enemies, he has deferred difficult political decisions. But this doctrine has reached its limits. Gaza shows that force cannot eliminate political grievances. Lebanon shows that deterrence does not prevent escalation. Iran shows that sanctions and confrontation do not erase influence. Endless war delivers only endless insecurity. The illusion of victory through force has collapsed. What remains is a reality of perpetual conflict with no end in sight. True security cannot rely solely on coercion. It requires legitimacy, the recognition by others that a state's actions are just lawful and sustainable. Israel once drew moral legitimacy from its founding story and its democratic institutions, but under Netanyahu, that legitimacy has eroded. The destruction in Gaza, the rejection of Palestinian sovereignty, and the reliance on U.S. vetoes have left Israel more isolated than ever. Without legitimacy, power breeds resistance, not stability. The lesson of history is clear. Nations that deny rights and rely on force eventually face isolation and decline. The United States sits at the center of this dilemma. For decades, Washington has enabled Netanyahu's strategy with weapons funding and diplomatic protection. But that alliance now exposes America to the same crisis of legitimacy. By defending Israel unconditionally, the U.S. undermines its own claims to uphold international law. Its credibility erodes not only in the Middle East, but across the global South. America faces a choice. It can continue enabling Netanyahu's doctrine of endless war, or it can use its influence to press for diplomacy, restraint, and the recognition of Palestinian rights. The former leads to further decline. The latter offers a chance at renewal. The alternative to decline is diplomacy. That means acknowledging the rights of Palestinians, pursuing negotiations for a viable state, and addressing the grievances that fuel perpetual conflict. It also means moving away from assassination and regime change as tools of policy and toward frameworks of law and dialogue. Diplomacy will not yield immediate triumphs, and it requires political courage, but it is the only path that offers stability. Netanyahu's stumble is the clearest evidence yet that the alternative endless war leads only to fragility. Netanyahu's crisis symbolizes a larger truth. Power without legitimacy is unsustainable. The facade of strength collapses when wars produce only devastation, when allies grow uneasy, and when citizens lose faith in their leaders. Israel, along with the United States, faces a choice. They can cling to denial and perpetuate conflict, or they can embrace diplomacy and build legitimacy. As Jeffrey Sachs might put it, real leadership is not about appearing strong, but about creating conditions for peace. Netanyahu's stumble is a warning. Whether Israel and its allies heed it will determine not only the fate of one leader, but the future of an entire region.